everybody. This is Dr. Machen. And what I want to do here in this podcast for the old colonial system is I really want to give you a pretty intense introduction to this time period. And my goal here is to give you a real good sense of what's going on back in England here in the 17th century, going into the 18th century, as well as the colonies, and what's maybe driving some of the things that people are thinking about and how they think about those things. So again, starting with that earlier 17th century, especially the period around that English Revolution, that Puritan Revolution, 1640s, 1650s. Look, it was a time of intense ferment in all areas of life. Religion, science, politics, domestic relations, culture, you name it. And that ferment was reflected in the literature of the era as well. So people are reading about these things, which also registered a heightened focus on an analysis of the self and personal life, how people viewed themselves. So this uncertainty of the mid to late 17th century created for a lot of Englishmen, English people, an opportune opening for them to establish what they considered real liberty, especially as the Puritan Revolution gathered its momentum. And so the immediate result was, I would say, a flourishing of political and religious ideas, the like of which England had never before experienced. So this period was witness to increasing chaos among its various political factions due to that controversy faced over religious and political democracy, as evident in the Puritan Revolution and the English Civil War. Okay, so we talked about it in class, but the execution of Charles I presented a political, moral, and religious crisis of justice for the English nation. And for the first time in European history, a monarch had been executed by what were by all accounts, a popular demand of his subjects. And this regicide forced these English citizens to question their own concepts of liberty. A great author of this time period, John Milton, would play the role of having to justify Parliament's actions and prove their actions as just and true in the eyes of God. Milton defended not only the overthrow, but also the execution of Charles I in his The Tenure of Kings and Magistrates. For Milton, the people do not need a representative body of magistrates to rid them of a tyrannical king. No, the people may rid themselves of such a king directly. Because according to Milton, and I'm quoting Milton here, the power of kings and magistrates is nothing else but what is only derivative, transferred and committed to them, in trust from the people to the common good of them all, in whom the power yet remains fundamentally and cannot be taken from them without a violation of their natural birthright. Now, it's also important to consider the outside influences that directed guys like John Milton to their certain endeavors of writing or speaking out. And you can see it. You can see it in Milton's sense of free will and liberty as directed by his God. Because Milton argued, and other literasts like John Milton argued, that the true nature of a monarch's power lay in the popular sovereignty that grants him that power. In other words, the people. The people have the right to overthrow a monarch who abuses his power. Importantly, the people derive this sovereignty from God. He explicitly denies the idea that power is given to a king or magistrates directly from God. And he challenges the notion of divine right, the doctrine that asserted a monarch's right by birth to rule as a type of divinity on earth. Because under divine right, no one would have the right to oppose a monarch, regardless of the monarch's actions and character. And I hope just from that little bit you get a sense of, man, that sure sounds a lot like what your colonial founding fathers will be yelling and screaming and standing upon over 100 years later. John Milton's doing it here in the mid-17th century. And so again, Milton and others were striving to demonstrate that liberty of conscience, to be quite honest with you, was one of the inviolable rights of free people. And you see it throughout his writings. Now, when you look at this old colonial system that we're going to be dealing with beginning next week, here in the early colonies, and as you're reading in the textbook, in the chapters assigned to this topic. I would argue to you, friends, that the origins of this American Revolution we're quickly coming upon were planted in 1607, right back there at Jamestown, Virginia. It was planted in 1607 with the beginnings of colonization. This was the first step towards revolution. Colonization was a natural step towards revolution, is what I'm saying. So the revolution itself was generations in the making. And this idea of independence was growing from the very moment these early colonists crossed the ocean. And the experiences that these early colonists experienced liberated their minds. They felt free from the many old world conventions. They began to believe these old world conventions need not apply in their new home, in the new world of America. The English elite in England had means of informal control for having to resort to force, and that was due to the high cost and unavailability of land. It was much harder for men to get ahead without help from one of those elites back in England. Not so in America, where land was plentiful and it was cheap. Okay? So let me kind of give you an idea of where we'll be going here in this lecture of the old colonial system of 1660 to 1773. So I've been talking to you about settling major colonies of Virginia and Massachusetts Bay. I mentioned some others, but now I'm going to mention them all. But I'm not going to go into detail in how they were settled. What I'm going to do is emphasize how those colonies were put together by England into a system, into an empire, a colonial system, a colonial system that lasted for over 100 years. And it worked pretty well for 100 years. And then I'll be ready to tell you how that system broke down and resulted in the American Revolution. Okay, guys? Now, one more thing. One more point before I dive deep into this old colonial system. And I want to talk to you about a book. Or actually, it's an essay. You're not going to have to be tested on it. I just want to talk to you about the concepts expressed in it. Frederick Jackson Turner wrote 2 brief essays, and they were called The Significance of the Frontier in American History and Contributions of the West to American Democracy. And in these 2 essays, Turner boldly asserted that it was the western frontier of America that was paramount to the development of democracy in America, not the vestiges of old world Europe found along the East Coast. So, according to Turner, it was due to the adventurous spirit of the early pioneer having to conquer new and uncharted lands that had helped to lead to democracy growing in America. And he argued that the frontier's role had been to constantly energize the growth of American democracy. It was the constant rebirth that America discovers each time she surged her boundaries westward. You can't simply look at her as a static institution, would argue Turner. Instead, she was a living organism, spreading the fruits of her labors westward. So as the colonists pushed ever westward, they distanced themselves from England not only in actual measurement of meters or miles, but also in culture. As new colonists arrived, they began the process of conquering this new and uncharted wilderness. But in the process, they themselves were changed as well. The more west they went, the more American, put that in quotes I guess, they became. They were no longer Scots, Germans, or Englishmen when they emerged from the Indian Trail. No, they were Americans. And as the early pioneer experimented with new means of how to live in a new land, those that followed would benefit from their knowledge, taking this knowledge with them as they continued westward. And this cycle would repeat over and over again as the pioneers, in effect, leapfrog one another as they traveled west. And as pioneers established new territories with democratic ideals, these ideals would filter back to the coast, where they would eventually find favor and be adopted into existing institutions. Okay? So for Turner, the idea that the development of American democracy was due to inherent traits brought over from Europe and the Europe ancestry, no. He would say that does not fit. That does not fit at all into his more American exceptionalist point of experience. Turner and many historians truly felt that something uniquely different had occurred when the first settlers set foot upon American soil. Okay? So I know, very long introduction, but I think it's important to hear some of that. So diving in, I just want to kind of move into this a bit. I'm not going to do the whole thing, obviously. But again, I'm wanting to talk to you about how, when we first started this course and I talked about Jamestown and Massachusetts Bay, those colonies weren't created by some elaborate plan by Great Britain, right? Jamestown was a venture in private capitalism, private enterprise, some guys coming over here to make money. And Massachusetts Bay, albeit it was a colony of Puritans trying to create a city on a hill, but it still was a joint stock company coming over here that was made up of Puritans to do that. In this lecture, we're going to be looking at England finally getting into the business of creating those colonies, and in a sense creating this empire in America. Okay? So by 1640, England had colonies in North America in two places, basically, guys. Virginia and Maryland. The Dutch were in between in a place called the New Netherlands. Now, did England plant those colonies with an elaborate plan by the government that said we're going to create an American empire? Well, you know the answer. No. It's not like that at all. Okay? One historian said that England created the colonies in a fit of absent-mindedness. And I think there's some truth to that, okay? Now, from 1640 to 1660, and that's where we left off in Massachusetts Bay, there were no more colonies created in America. And that was because of that Puritan Revolution, okay? But in 1660, things will change, okay? So from 1640 to 1660, the images you're looking at right here, that was all from the Puritan Revolution, the English Revolution, where Charles I was killed. His family had to flee to France. Oliver Cromwell and his Puritan armies won and set up the Commonwealth, the Puritan rule that lasted to 1660. And as we talked about in the last lecture, by 1660, the Puritans had fallen apart in England. And so we've already discussed this, but once Puritan rule came to an end, and the ruling family was put back on the throne in the person of Charles II, aka the Restoration, right? The new king, Charles II, is the guy that began to consider the colonies. In other words, he basically, once he got his crown on his head and got into the business of being king and looking at his holdings, he's the guy that probably sat down and said something along the lines of, hey, we probably should do something with those colonies and make it work for the benefit of England. In other words, I think we need a colonial system. Let's build an empire. So we can date the beginnings of the old colonial system from 1660. From 1660 with Charles II's restoration. Now, the creation of the colonial system meant several things that are very important. The first thing is that the idea of creating an empire would lead to a second wave of colonies. The first wave was before the 1640s. The second wave would occur between 1660 and 1690. And between those two dates, in those 30 years, there were 6 more colonies created. And you don't have to know them, but they were New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, North and South Carolina. They linked up what was already there and used the Carolinas to protect them from the South. They added one more in Georgia in the 1730s as a place for the English convicts, right? Now, and they would be used as a buffer between Spanish Hill, Florida. What is important about all 6 of these colonies that you do need to remember, and it's there on the slide for you, is that all of those colonies that we just created between 1660 and 1690 are of a particular type of colony. It's called a proprietary colony. And all that means is that they were owned by somebody or by a family. Earlier colonies had not been proprietary colonies. Walter Raleigh had proved that was just not a good idea. You couldn't afford to. No one person had the resources to do that. But by the time you get to 1660, it was possible. It was easier because there were so many people already living in the colonies. There's already an available workforce, labor force already there. So, Pennsylvania is a good example. William Penn, right? Related to those Quakers. Charles II actually owed the Penn family a favor for helping get him back on the throne of England. So he would pay off the Penn family by giving them land in the New World. It cost Charles II nothing, and if it was successful, England got another colony. And Pennsylvania, guys, remained the property of the Penn family all the way to the American Revolution. So that's a good example of a proprietary colony. Now the next thing we need to talk about in terms of when you build an empire. Building an empire required applying a certain set of economic ideas to the colonies that would benefit England. Because, of course, England's not doing this for her health. England wants a return on their investment. They want a profit. So this economic set of principles I'm talking about, this theory, is mercantilism. Now, you can read your textbook about this, you can get this in your economics class, but for our purposes, we can kind of water it down to its essence. And, I think this is like a cluster of ideas that developed over a period of time. And the basic point of it is, which I think is still relevant today, holds that all nations are in economic competition with one another. And so I think that still applies. And in this competition, all countries wanted a favorable balance of trade. Now let's stop and think about that for a minute. When you really think about what I just said, a favorable balance of trade, that's kind of weird, because I thought a balance was equal. How do you have a favorable balance, or a balance that is favorable? That indicates one's more than another. Well, what they meant was, when they said favorable balance of trade, is that when you have a favorable balance of trade, your country is selling more than your country's buying, right? And in order to attain that favorable balance, you want other nations sending you gold, silver, etc. to buy things from you, right? Does that make sense, guys? The more gold and silver in your country, the stronger your country is. That's what you want. You want other countries sending you precious metals to settle up an unfavorable balance of trade in your favor. Now, where do the colonies fit into all this? Well, people in England really love tobacco, right? And England does not produce tobacco. Therefore, she's going to have to buy tobacco from other countries. She's got to import tobacco from other countries and from other colonies. And of course, the Spanish have colonies in the Americas that produce tobacco. So England doesn't want to have to send English money. She doesn't want her English merchants buying tobacco from the Spanish and sending English money to the Spanish. No, not at all. So what does England need in the colonies that will ensure that a lot of money will not leave England and go to another country? Right? You see where we're going with this. So the colonies, this is so important to remember, the colonies are utilized to produce for the mother country what she cannot produce for herself. So I want to say that one more time. The colonies are utilized to produce for the mother country, England, what England cannot produce for herself. So England can't produce tobacco. She wants her English colonies, like Virginia, to produce tobacco to ship to England. The same can be said for sugar. The same can be said for timber, indigo, you name it. Anything England does not produce vast quantities of herself and has to buy outside the country of England, she wants the colonies, if at all possible, to produce those things. Because again, those are English colonies, and that means English money stays in-house, right? And they're not having to spend any of their money outside. And then they want French, Spanish, Germans, you name it. They want all those people buying stuff from England as well and from the colonies as well. That just means more money for the English treasury. Okay, guys? That's this favorable balance of trade. Yeah, they want them sending them things like that. some nice gold coins. I wish I had a few of those. Now, when you set up colonies with this in mind, do you think you can just sit back and think that the colonies will do the right thing economically? Obviously not. People are going to do what will make them the most. They're going to pursue their own interests from the very beginning to the end. Therefore, mercantilism meant trade regulations when it came to the colonies. Mercantilism meant that England was now going to have to tell the colonies how they had to behave when it came to the economy. They had to be regulated. So in the first 3 years of 1660 to 1663, England would pass a variety of regulatory acts to enforce mercantilism. And you're going to see this in your textbook. They're always called the Navigation Acts. I just want to summarize the Navigation Acts that I think are the most important. And I'll talk about this again in class. The first one is pretty cool. It says all goods going into or out of an English colony had to go on English ships. Owned by an English captain and crewed by an English crew. Why that requirement? Well, there's money to be made by transporting those products from other countries. I mean, the Dutch had ships like crazy. All right, so, some English merchant at the time, there was no law, says that Chase Machen, an English merchant living in London, I've got goods, I want to send my goods to Virginia. I could go contract out with some Dutch merchant and pay him to transport my goods, just like modern day companies today hire a trucking company to move their goods. England is saying here in that first bullet point that, well, we know you do that, and that's fine. We don't want to shut your business down, but we just want you to hire an English company to move your goods because we want English money staying in the English economy. So that's pretty smart. That's pretty smart. Number two, key colony products were put on an enumerated list. Those items that were on the enumerated list were called enumerated articles. When the enumerated articles left an English colony, they had to go to an English port before going anywhere else. So enumerated articles are things like, tobacco, sugar, timber for English ships, things that England cannot produce for itself. So what's England saying here? They're saying that they want English merchants to get first shot at those goods. Okay? And look, you're going to get some of this in your textbook, and I know it's kind of complicated, but here's what England's doing on that second bullet point. England says, look, our English merchants, this is the government of England saying, our English merchants, just plain old English businessmen that own companies in town that sell things to Englishmen, right? We know they want to buy tobacco. We know they want to buy sugar because that's high demand, things that people buy. But we also know the French want it. We also know the Spanish want it. So we are telling our English people that live in Virginia, hey, Virginians, when you get ready to load up one of these ships you're looking at here on the slide with a whole bunch of tobacco, we don't care if the French are willing to pay you double for that tobacco. We're telling you by law, through these navigation acts, you must first come to England so our English merchants can get first shot at your goods. Okay? And if there's anything left over after our merchants go over your ship, then you can go off to some foreign country and sell the remaining items you have left. Okay? We just want first shot because we're England and you're Englishmen. Okay, guys? Then that last point. Virtually all manufacturers of fancy items of food, wine, etc., regardless of where they came from, had to come back through England on its way to the colonies. So what does that mean? What does that mean? Well, that meant that that same ship that just left, Virginia, went to England, unloaded, let's say, 3/4 of its tobacco cargo in England. It's got a quarter left. It can now go to France and sell the rest. And it does. It sells the rest of its goods there in France. So there's that ship and that captain. He's got an empty cargo ship and a pocket full of money. Well, he's not going to sail straight back to Virginia with nothing on his cargo vessel. He's going to buy up all kinds of exotic goods that he knows will sell real well back in the colonies. So what England is saying here in number 3 is, okay, we know you're going to do that, and that's fine. But before you go straight back to Virginia, you must have to go back through England first, because English merchants are going to get first shot at those goods. And then you can go back to the colonies if anything's left. Why is that? That's because England wants the colonies buying anything they need from England as well. They want the Englishmen in the colonies, when they want pretty dresses for their wives, furniture, any kind of exotic good like tea, you name it, they don't want them buying their goods from France. They don't want them buying their goods from Spain. They want them buying their goods from English merchants in London. And it's the simple concept, once again, of keeping money in-house. England is passing these navigation acts for the sole purpose of keeping English money in-house, trying to get more money coming in than going out from their English subjects. Okay, guys? And I'll go over this again in class if I need to, and answer any questions you have. But it's very important to understand why they're passing these navigation acts. Okay? Now, when you look at this setup, it sounds bad for the colonies. It does sound bad when you look at it. It's constraining the colonials. It's making them do harsh things. And some people look at these navigation acts and say, well, look, this is what must have caused the American Revolution. Well, look, these things were passed 1660 to 1663. The American Revolution doesn't occur to 100 years later. So if these things caused the revolution, that's one heck of a delayed reaction. So obviously they didn't, okay, guys? They did not. And here's the point as to why they didn't. These things might sound bad, but they're not as bad in reality and in practice as they sound on paper. And again, it's a broad generalization, but here's why. What do you think most people in the English colonies did to make a living? Well, look, they're farmers. They tended to be subsistence farmers, making just enough to live on. And as you move from being a subsistence farmer to making cash crops you want to sell a whole bunch of and make money like tobacco, the best available market in the world in the 1660s was England. You were going to be sending your stuff first to England anyway, right? And who had the best ships? The English. The English had the best merchant marine. So even if, yes, the Dutch are out there and the Spanish are out there willing to rent out their ships, the English had the best merchant marine in the business, and you would probably want them before anybody else. You're probably looking to hire them anyway. And of course, England had the best manufacturing as well. So England was going to be the first place you would look to buy your nice furniture and clothes from, okay? It's England. So I hope my point's clear. It might sound terrible, but it did not force the colonials to do anything they probably weren't going to do anyway. And hey, they also got the benefit of the British military protection, right? Remember, there's not that many colonials over here yet right now. In 1660, there's about 50,000 colonials. And they're over here hanging out with their good buddies, the French and the Spanish. So they need that British Navy. Okay, guys? Now, when you look at these colonies and how they fit into this mercantilist system, with the British trying to create this empire, taking the navigation acts and laying them over the top of the colonies to make sure they're behaving properly, buying their goods from England and selling their goods to England first. Some colonies fit into that system better than others. For example, the southern colonies were predominantly agricultural economically. They produced a lot of the things that England wanted. South Carolina made indigo, Virginia made tobacco, etc. They didn't have any manufacturing. So, hey, they might have lost some money when dealing with England over these types of items, but they fit into this system pretty well. But then when you look at the New England colonies, like Massachusetts, they didn't fit into that system too well. They didn't have a lot of agriculture. What they did is they got into fishing, shipbuilding, and then after people got into shipbuilding, they began using those ships to haul their products. Commerce was very active. The point being, they began to develop their own manufacturing as well. So New England, these New England colonies in your map there, I guess that's pink or flesh colored, they were developing an economy that was just like England's economy. They were actually in competition with England. So their interest did not lay so much in working in this old colonial system that England was trying to create. Does that make sense, I hope? Now, being good Englishmen, because they're all Englishmen. You're going to see some of these Englishmen evading the law, like these navigation acts. And that shouldn't shock you, because of course all Americans obey every law in the United States. Because I am sure all of you, if you have your driver's license, and when you do get your driver's license, I am absolutely sure that you all will be obeying the speed limit perfectly every time you get in the car, right? And you've never broken any traffic laws in your life, nor will you ever break a traffic law in your life. Look, this is just how it is. These Englishmen are going to find a way to make the most money they can. And if violating the navigation acts will allow them to make a heck of a lot more money and they can get away with it, they will do it. Okay, guys? So, for example, for example, if you're a New England merchant, let's say up there in Massachusetts, Chase Machen's living in Massachusetts, right? And I want to make some money by selling tobacco. So I go down to Virginia and I load up my ship with a whole cargo load of tobacco. And France has got top price for tobacco. I want to go to France. I want to sell my goods in France. I can make more money there. Okay? Now, according to the Navigation Acts, I'm supposed to stop off in England, right? Before I go to France. Now, you can probably make money if you obey those rules, but if you don't obey those rules, you can make more money. So, yeah, they're going to break the rules, and it was hard to enforce. And gradually, word began to filter down to the English that the colonies were not obeying those rules. And they're going to have to make some steps about it. So, again, how am I breaking that law? So, you're not going to be tested on this. I just think it's kind of cool. So, I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but again, let's say I own a company here in Massachusetts. And according to the Navigation Acts, that if I go down here to Virginia and I load up with a cargo load of tobacco, I'm supposed to go first straight across the ocean to England. Let's say this is England here. And sell as much as the English merchants want. And then if there's anything left, then I can go down here to France and sell my goods. Okay? So what about this? What if I just load up my tobacco in Virginia, and then I sail right down here to North Carolina, make a U-turn, and then go straight to France? Would that not work as well? Because all the Navigation Act said was, when I leave here, I must first go to an English port. It doesn't say England, it just says English port. Well, look, it's 1660. This is an English port. And that's what a lot of guys did. They would just find loopholes in the laws and sail straight to France. And then when they got stopped by, some British frigate, what are you doing? You're breaking the Navigation Acts. And so, no, sir, no, I'm not. And he'd pull out a copy of the Navigation Acts and say, look, it doesn't say England here. It just says English port. I follow the letter of the law. And they were. So look, England will find out about this. And in 1673, a date you might want to remember, 1673, they're going to do something to try to close this legal loophole and try to tighten up on these Navigation Acts. And here's what they said in 1673. In 1673, England would send custom collectors to America for the very first time to make sure these American colonials were obeying the Navigation Acts. So for the first time in the colonials' history, been there since 1607, right? In 1673, England would send custom officials, government officials, to come to the colonies, make sure they're following the Navigation Acts. And of course, once they got here, they're going to see just how bad these colonials are breaking the law. Okay, guys? And it will force England to take a very, very bold step in 1686. And this is where I'm going to pick up in class this week. So again, make sure that you've read the chapter. If you've got any questions about anything I've said to this point, you've jotted them down and you can ask in class. But we'll pick up in class with this Dominion of New England and how big a threat this was to what would eventually be the future of the United States. I'll kind of tip my hat here and tell you that if the Dominion of New England had survived and been successful, I don't think you have an American Revolution. I don't think you get a United States of America in the sense we have it today. So I'll see you guys next week. Have a great weekend.